All right, so back to the map. I think what I like about the map is it gives you a very good visual representation of the kind of research that's happening where, right? So in the red, what I found is that studies that came out of the red, so applied research into questions of autonomy and the relationship between autonomy and decision-making, well, abortion decision-making or reproductive health decision-making actually, it tends to happen in those areas. So the Africa, India, those kinds of countries. Also, when I expanded the research to decision-making and gender within marriage, so just more generally, it still was in those kinds of areas. And so embedded in this research is the understanding or the perception that these women have less autonomy, or they're not entirely independently autonomous. These countries have actually been flagged by the UN Women as having more issues with gender inequality. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, and they would then be under a lot more pressure as far as expectations, societal norms, as far as timing of children, and also the size of families. And that impacts their decision making then. Okay, then when these kinds of areas of discussion of autonomy and abortion decision making or reproductive decisions, when it's moved to the green areas, so Australia, Britain, US and Canada, and then the research tends to focus on groups such as young women or adolescents or immigrants. And these groups are again perceived to have less autonomy and thus limited in their agentic pursuit of their own goals, generally due to age or liminal status or something like that. So the overarching concerns of these studies, it leans towards an investigation of how women are overcoming constraints and then producing change in structure. And it tends to be weighted, towards the agency that ruptures boundaries rather than the agency that conforms and reproduces structures. So then alternatively, other research in these same areas then, the green zones that we're talking about, where autonomy and then access to abortion is taken for granted, then the dominant area of research tends to shift to rights and whether laws and policy making is actually producing the change, producing the access and availability for and freedom of reproductive choice to women or not. Other areas of concern in these areas are the pro-life oppositional stance towards abortion, as well as the prevalence and impact of abortion stigma. So those are kind of the areas of research that are happening in these zones. So you tend to have these two groups where one, either you presume that the women have less autonomy and then less access, less agentive action happening, or you assume that it's there, but then you change the focus of the research not to agency, but to the infringements on rights or those kinds of topics. So I've taken the assumed autonomy of women in Perth, where abortion is considered relatively a normalised health procedure and where it's also perceived that there's little need to push boundaries. And I've gone to that area then to also then investigate agency rather than the rights and the policy making. And so I have a research question. My research concern then is to examine the liminal space between the individual choice and social context. And that's the space where an abortion decision is made. So my interest is less in the lies in the unresearched area or relatively unresearched area of the agency of autonomous women regarding a relatively unremarkable abortion decision, and it's shaped or constrained by societal structures and the broad cultural narratives. So I've positioned the participant as autonomous, and I've positioned abortion as relatively normalised as well. And so this is my question. So how does one make a personal decision such as an abortion within the social political context? And I'm in Perth, and the research has happened in Perth. So for my conceptual framework, I just wanted to talk about these two ideas, kind of interlocking ideas of agency and structure and habitus. So my thinking's been shaped, and the project's been shaped by, and I'll talk about three theorists here, Sherry Ortner, Anthony Giddens and Pierre Bourdieu. So Ortner argued that the theory of practice and the rise of the acting agent is in opposition to the structuralist approach to theory. So moving away from society as a bundle of structures that just predetermines what's going to happen and what people decide, going more to the individual, and that the individual then becomes the unit of analysis and how they consciously act to produce change within structure. I find this relationship between agency and structure very intriguing, but also quite elusive as well. So going to Giddens, he argued that agency and structure are inseparable, that while structure limits and shapes an actor's actions, it is also reproduced in a recursive manner, so like a feedback loop, and he called it structuration. For him, agency is intentional action, even if the agent is not able to fully justify their actions or to anticipate the changes and the consequences that are going to flow out of that action. At the same time, his structuration theory tends to be focused on everyday practice, so habitual and pattern behaviour and routine activities that require little forethought, and that's why I didn't feel that he fit quite my project, because an abortion experience is not everyday practice. It's not unintentional either. It's more like what Ortner called a highly intentionalized moment of practice. And so the question is, what does agency look like in those moments of full intentionality? And so I turn to Bourdieu's concept of habitus as an overarching principle. So he says that habitus is the organising principle of an individual's action, and so that actors engage in certain practices without being forced. This concept speaks to the internalisation of values and practices so that actions and modes of thought feel natural to the individual. So with this system of internalised values, we then operate in the world and act in certain ways, make certain decisions. And Bourdieu doesn't call them rules, rather he calls them principles, because rules would sort of determine an outcome. You must follow make these decisions, rather than principles, and people improvise. So if you think about it, improvisation requires a strong level of understanding, a strong level of skill. And he's talking about that kind of level where you take the principle and you improvise to, and I guess that's where the agency comes in more. So in his last part of the definition here, the improvisations that produce practices, and here again you have the recursive nature, similar to Giddens' theory of structuration, that the structures have been internalised to produce the habitus, and then they're acted out externally to produce and reproduce structures. And so then my question is that even in these moments of full intentionality, to what extent is the decision still shaped by habitus? To what extent is it shaped by that deeply internalised structure? And this aspect is actually is normally overlooked in research regarding abortion decision making. So I employed two main methods. I did 20 semi-structured interviews with women around Perth, and I was particularly interested in the narrative of their abortion experience, their abortion decision making and experience. So it's a retrospective study, but I also asked them to draw circle mud maps as I call them. And I did want to spend a bit of time on that because I know that there are some experts in anthropology, sociology who are network analysis people, and so I did want to spend a bit of time on this. A similar study actually of interest about the relationship between the individual and the network and investigating how that works together is a study that was done in England by a group, and they were studying non-participation in higher education. So they were very focused on the individual, but at the same time they were looking at how that network shaped and impacted the decision to not participate in higher education. They didn't draw maps though, but they did interview non-ego others, as they would be called. All right, so normally in an ego-centered study, you give the participant a paper like this with the circles in it, and the participant is the person in the middle, the you, or ego as it's called. And then as they name different people in their network, they are also then asked to place them in the circles. So someone that's really important in this, a network would be placed in the inner circle, and then someone that's of less importance or not important would be placed on the outside. However, for my study, I wasn't really interested in the network as such. Because it's specific to this one moment, this one decision moment. It's not specific to how that network shapes their life as such. It's just how people impacted or influenced the decision that was made. And so I wasn't totally satisfied with this method. I mean, each method that you use to try to investigate the network, you know, there's always pros and cons and will give you different information. And each method also has constraints. So one of the constraints with this one is that it tends to you can collect the information of the people in the network, but it tends not to ask about people who have either fallen out or deliberately placed out. So that's one constraint, and I will talk a little bit more about that later because that does come up in one of the drawings I'll share with you later. And the other constraint has to do with the you in the middle. So when you give a predetermined drawing like this, then obviously people have to think of themselves in the middle, but research has actually shown that some participants don't have difficulty conceiving of themselves in the middle. And I did actually have, oh, the arrows are working. I did have a participant that actually drew it in a line. So she put herself on the edge and she drew her network in a line across the page, which I thought was quite interesting. However, most of the others did put themselves in the middle with their network fanning out from there. And so back to this picture with you, and I'll just say why I wasn't so happy with the you in the middle is because it's already given, and the circle, it's encapsulated already. And so I thought, well, I didn't want to predetermine this view of self, because this is actually what I wanted to find out, like how are people seeing themselves in their network in regards to this decision, and how are people viewing that experience of the network regarding themselves also, right? So I didn't want to predetermine the you, the circle, and say that size, etc. And so what I did is I actually just removed all the constraints and I gave them a blank piece of paper, and that's why I called them circle mud maps. So the mud map actually is an Australian term. As I discussed with, I had a discussion with Lucas and we talked about mud maps and he wasn't aware of this term. So I thought I'd better explain it. It does come from when travellers would randomly meet in the outback and tell each other their tales about the travels. And they often accompany their story with, you know, drawing something in the dirt, a map in the dirt or in the mud. They could outline different reference points, interesting things that had happened along the journey. I was thinking you might have done something like this similar before Google Maps, if you remember that, when before Google Maps were there. But anyways, for these maps, scale and accuracy is not the important feature. Rather, it's the landmarks and it's the experience of the journey. Another interesting thing is that they can be done collaboratively, so people can add to them, like the hero of the story can add to the drawing, the mud map. And it also becomes a tangible expression of the experience, but at the same time, it doesn't make sense without the narrative. And that's what I've found with my maps as well. They don't really make sense without the narrative, but they give a visual image, and it's quite neat. Some researchers have argued that a map is a way to make sense of the experience that preceded the map. So that's kind of important as well, that it's like in my research, that the narrative comes first, that the experience came first, and it's the map that's kind of helping them make sense of it. So these elements, they dovetailed with my project, and so we did do some drawing after the narrative. So here's one example. I've got two examples. So this is from someone called Darlene, and the names were chosen at the time of interview. She's currently married with 2 children, aged 7 and 4. She feels that she's an older mum. She's delayed having children until in her late 30s. In her network of friends, that's not unusual. She works part-time and was home with her son the day that I met her. At the time of the abortion, Darlene was experiencing a number of difficulties, including difficulties in her marriage. When she found out that she was pregnant, she was also told that there were 2, so she was expecting twins. She told me that she burst into tears because, as she said, it would have wrecked me. And she repeated that, it would have wrecked me. Her narrative continued with going to the doctor and telling her husband that she was pregnant and had booked an abortion. When I asked Darlene to draw it out for me, she drew a large circle, as you can see, drew a large circle to depict herself and grudgingly thought she should add her husband. She explained to me as she drew, well, I kind of feel that there's probably only two people to be in this, and if I drew it, it would be me and then my husband, and really, I feel it was my decision. I didn't really care what he said. Glad he agreed, but it was my decision, and I had already made that decision when I'd gone to the doctors. So if he didn't agree, it wouldn't have made a difference. When I reminded her that she had actually mentioned in her narrative about her mum and her network of friends, I says, well, but you haven't drawn them. And she refused. She's like, no, I'm not putting them on there because they're just part of my support team. And I do seek them out for advice and support sometimes, but in this case, no. And because it was twins, it was 200% certainty that it wasn't going to happen. So I think this drawing revealed how Darlene felt about her own position. I think that she would say that she was in the centre and she was in control of this decision. So the second one is from someone called Ali. She's also married, also got 2 children. Together with her husband, they own a small 3-bedroom house. But one of the bedrooms has been taken over by her husband's music gear. She takes pride in the fact that they own their house, even though it's a small one and not, their forever home. But she feels confident that they can provide for her family. She was still in her 20s when she became pregnant the 3rd time. It was totally unplanned, and it would have been difficult to accommodate the child as both their current house and their finances would have been significantly stretched. At the same time, she attests that, and this is what she said, although it was unexpected, part of me just instinctively thought, wow, another, and I really, really wanted that child. I really did in my heart. However, her husband was firm. No, the time is not right, it's not going to work. He did not pressure her into terminating, and she believes that if she was adamant that she wanted to keep with her child, that he would have said, okay. But he was so firm, and this is a quote from her. He was so firm, he was loving and compassionate about it. We never fought over it, but he was just so solid in his opinion that I knew, he's right. I have to trust what he's saying. And he could so clearly explain it. And she goes on to say, there were even times before the procedure that I'd say, are you sure? Are you sure there's no way? Are you really sure? Can you think about it one more day? Or, can we imagine that we did go ahead and what we might do? So I'd present him with these scenarios constantly, and he'd always come back to me, and he was always rational, and he never got sucked into it. And in the end, she realised that she did not want the possibility of potential resentment in their marriage. They'd invested considerable amount of time and energy into their relationship, and she decided that the process of going through the abortion and then healing was going to be less traumatic than having a divide in their marriage. So out of loyalty to her husband and her marriage relationship, she decided to go with his decision. And then she also said, I don't like this notion that the woman can do what she wants because it's her body. I think he should deserve a say as well. You don't have to go with it, but what he'd like you to do. But this notion of it's only the woman matters, I just think that's so wrong. I don't know how you can isolate the father like that, the man involved, and completely invalidate his feelings. So when I asked Ali to draw this out, she wrote her husband's name in the same circle as herself, as you can see in the middle there. I blanked it out because she actually wrote his name. So contrary to Darlene's drawing, where she confidently filled the paper with herself, Ali shared the circle of self then with her husband. She chose loyalty to her husband over her desire to keep the pregnancy. And that was because, she'd not fully embraced the idea that her body was her own. And she did use these words as well, that I'm definitely not a feminist, and also felt that she didn't need feminism because we're just equal. She also demarcated 2 sections where you see the lines here, and these are the people that she excluded from her decision making, deliberately chose not to speak with them. And of note are their in-laws, and she says that's because they were Christians, so she felt they would be unsupportive. And then her friends up here, who she felt would just give platitudes of follow your heart, do what you want, and she didn't think that was very helpful. So my question is that, well, why is this important, this perception of self and this perception of the experience of self in the network? Why is it important? And research has shown that women who do not feel that they own their decision, that they are more likely to have negative emotional outcomes. And Ali did tell me that she did struggle, and at the time of the interview, she said she's about 90% healed. So I just find that interesting.
How much after her abortion was that, Dorinda?
I think about 5 years or so.
Wow.
So yeah, approximately. So that's a brief summary of the methodology. And like I say, any feedback is welcome. I am actually working on an article on this because I think that this is transferable to other health decisions as well, and how like you have the similar situation where the healthcare professional is dealing with the patient or the client, but the network is always there, and that impacts. And I guess there would also be you could think of other cases where if it's not going to be the patient's own decision, what are those outcomes going to be? Yeah. So, and for this study, you know, we like to think that the decision's always like Darlene, but if you look at others, it's not. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. All right, so I'm just going to go to my findings, and I've divided them into 3 themes here because I felt that the participants touched on these 3 themes, feminisms, and then constructing or invoking really the other, and the personal decision. I'm presenting it linearly, but they didn't speak of it in that way, obviously. So I am indebted to those feminist scholars in cultural studies, including people like Alison Bartlett and there's Imelda Wheelahan as well from the GRS. This body of research, they examine the popularisation of feminisms and how it's presented through the media to different groups within society. And they argue that many people growing up now, they first encounter feminisms through the media representation of it, rather than the academic wrestling with the theory of feminisms. And so then it will be through TV series or girls' magazines. And consequently, these people, they grow up then and adopt, take on the ideas of their own individuation and the plethora of choices available to them. And these ideals are more embedded than in the liberal feminist framework. So a focus on equality and for the individual as a free agent, and being able to live that life free of predetermined choices and free of constraints of choices as well. These ideals have now then become common sense, and Sarah Bennett-Weiser, she described it to be like fluoride in the water. So it's there, but you don't notice it as much. At first I was surprised about this because participants in research coming from Africa, they were a lot more vocal, and the feminism was a lot stronger in that research. And so after my first few interviews, I came back to you guys and I said, "They're not using feminist rhetoric. Am I doing something wrong?" But yeah, I don't think I was, and I don't think I was actually correct either. It's just that the feminist rhetoric was not front and foremost. It's as I had anticipated actually. But it was more that it would just slip in as a by the way, or an of course, or like someone said, well, you know, it's our bodies at the end of the day, sort of like that sort of a way that it would come in instead. And I now interpret this as evidence of that liberal feminist framework that they use to live their everyday lives, and that they've embraced these notions of equality for women, individuality for women, who are able to participate in society through the solid choices that they will then make. So they don't invoke feminist arguments for the decisions because they don't feel the need to push the boundaries, but rather they're using the common sense decisions that are informed by these feminists, the liberal feminist frameworks, and they've absorbed them into their habitus, and so it's become common sense, and they use these to inform then their decision. And they're actually horrified at the idea that others might not have that availability of those common sense decisions. And that will come up later as well. However, the experience of an unplanned pregnancy and then subsequent abortion, it often disturbs this comfortable path, and assumptions about equality and choice become disrupted. And then at least retrospectively, these tacitly held ideas, they become examined. And they come to the fore as well, and sometimes some are used then to justify their abortion. We'll just talk a bit then about the other, or invoking the other, constructing the other. More invoking actually, really, than constructing. I've identified quite a few. So you're the first main category of those against abortion. As in Ali's drawing, some of those are religious. Not always. Some people are also anti for not religious reasons. There's also the monolithic category of men. You normally talk about a monolithic category of women, but in this case it's actually men, and homogenous as well, and they're the ones that are telling you what to do with your body, and that idea is invoked as well. But interestingly, the partners are not included in this category of men, even though some of the partners did not want them to have an abortion. It's actually the other women where they talked quite a lot about other women. And Charlotte Brunston, she's also examining the popular feminism. She argues that women often have a sense of disidentity, and that this disidentity is actually part of the inheritance of feminism. And these come up in sentences that start with "I'm not," right? So Ali is like, "I'm not a feminist," or I had another one who said, "I'm not an extreme feminist." You know, you can interrogate these as well, but yeah, the interesting sentences. And so, yeah, so who are these others? I have some quotes for each of a quote for each of these sections: the poor, teens, which are all young women, foolish woman, and also women in other places. So poor women first. This is from Liz. She said to me, well, when I see mums who look obviously jobless, alcoholics, smoke, you know, pushing a pram and smoking, then you just feel, why even bother popping? And she continued as well, because when I look at them, I'm like, what are they thinking? Why? You know, I mean, you know, the world's overpopulated as it is. If you're going to bring a child into the world, surely you want to be doing your best for him or her. And this raises the question of, like, you know, are poor women good enough mothers, or are they eligible to be mothers, or should they be excluded from being, even being mothers? The second one is about the young women or teens. I've got a fairly short quote there, but she actually said a lot about being teens. She refused to be a teen mum, but at the same time she actually became a teen mum as well, because she became pregnant again. So I will, share quite a bit with what she says. So one of the big deciding factor for me is that I didn't want to be a single teen mum, because that is so in the word. It's not, because she did become a teen mum. But, you know, all those shows and the way that they portray teen mums, and she's talking about TV shows now, it's just, and I just refused to be. But I also ended up being one. So I was like, I refuse to be a single mum, because people are just automatically, and this is what she continues to say, she's just a baby. How could she raise a baby? You know, all of those negative, really negative ideas. People just assume that teenagers can't raise babies and be decent people, which is not true. That's a big thing. I think teen mum, but then she says, I used to watch teen mums all the time when she was 18. And watching them, she's like, what on earth? There's so much drama, like baby, daddy issues, money issues, and the kids always look feral. She was very interesting, actually, because, like, on the one hand, she refused to be the teen mum, but then became the teen mum. And so she actually really critiques quite strongly the TV image of teen mum and society's low opinion of young mums, teen mums. And she's actually quite critical also of the difference in the hospital treatment that she received when she had her first child as a teenage mother, compared to when she had her second one when she was married. And she says that they treated her very, very differently. She was quite critical of this. The next one, this would be the foolish woman. So usually that's someone who's uneducated, but especially around sexuality and sexual health and contraceptives. And it's from Sarah. The background of her quote is that she was using contraceptives, she was using a coil implant, but then when they did the abortion, they couldn't find it. And so she had to have follow-up appointments trying to find what had happened to this coil. So then she had to explain to them when she went in for these follow-up appointments. I had to explain to them why I was there, and I felt, for some reason, I felt a bit silly. Even though it was clearly an accident that I got pregnant, I was taking contraception and it shouldn't have happened, but I did feel a bit foolish. And she says, she continues, I actually thinking about it now, I realise why I felt foolish, because when they did the abortion, they said, do you want us to put the implant in your arm so that you don't fall pregnant again? And I think as a student midwife, which is what she was at the time, that's what you kind of did to the young girls who accidentally fell pregnant. You offered them contraceptive or an implant before they left the hospital because that was your chance to make sure that they didn't come back in 9 months' time. And I was like, yeah, but I'm not a silly little girl. So, yeah, I thought that was interesting as well. In these quotes, I think that you really have the strong underlying tropes of good mothering, what it looks like, and who's able to do that, who's able to be that, who's eligible. Is really this factor of who's eligible and ineligible. Sharon Hayes used the term intensive mothering about in 1998, and that was really to investigate the emotional, financial, and also the time and the usually full-time investment that usually mothers then would have to give in order to raise the children. But this kind of mothering is best suited to middle-class families, usually two-parent families, where one is the full-time breadwinner and one is the full-time carer. So this model then excludes those who lack financial means or are too young, they lack stability perhaps, or relationship stability, and it excludes those from being able to be proper, I guess, mothers, good mothers. And this trope of around mothering actually continues to surface now still in a lot of the studies around mothering, and also in studies around abortion decision making, such as this one. And women use it as a way to explain why that their abortion was preferable to keeping it. So unless one, it's kind of like unless one is able to fully provide for the child in these ways, and are quite prescribed, it's considered kinder and more responsible to terminate the pregnancy. Just the last one as well, because this was slightly different. This had more to do with feminism, and it's referring to women in other places. This is from Susie, because it also portrays this idea that I have feminism, but they don't, and they need it, but I don't, because I've kind of arrived in a way. So anyway, she says, so I lived in Senegal for a year and I was a teacher there. We ran a girls' club because, you know, like men can have up to 4 wives, and it's just women are very much at the bottom of the heap there. She also said that you're put in prison if you have an abortion there. And so then a little bit later, she reflected on this and just went, wow, and here in the West, we've got so much freedom. And yeah, this idea, this sentiment that almost like, yeah, I've been made free by feminism, and so I'm free now, I can make the choices, I'm free to decide, and they compare it to others then that don't have that freedom. And it's not just women living in other places. I mean, this refers also back to that map that I showed you of where the research on autonomy and agency needs to be done. But it also they also then speak about girls here who haven't been so lucky as to get the sexual health education, and about contraceptives, etc. It's kind of like, but yeah, it's sort of spoken about in the past as if, you know, we've arrived, or I've arrived to this knowledge, this space. So I think the function of this othering is to project an image of the responsible decision maker. Because in the liberal feminist setting, this idea of freedom and choice also then requires this responsible decision maker. And rather than being bullied into choices, or that, you know, these choices are just prescribed for you, or keeping a pregnancy by default, shall we say, now the responsible and free individual has the opportunity to make thoughtful choices. And so the irresponsible other is kind of kept there to bolster the image of the responsible self. Right, so that, you remember my 3 things to get into the third topic here, the third theme? Yeah, so in the journey towards a decision, this is the last part, the personal decision. I've described the feminist framework that the participants engage in like every day. and how that framework's become common sense, or in the language of habitus, how it's been internalised and now becomes that set of principles which produces the behaviour and guides decision making. Also talked about the other and its function. Okay, so but then it's interesting because then when it comes to the actual decision to terminate, that experience is experienced very personally. And it's kind of like, well, I have the quote here from Bourdieu that forgetting the history that produced the habitus allows the habitus to operate. And it's like all of that, the feminist setting, etc., all of that is kind of forgotten. And then it's still a very personal decision and it's experienced personally. In studies into reasons for an abortion, there's a team from led by someone called Biggs. He argued that the decision is made as a response to every woman's unique circumstances. However, there's a lot of commonality in the narratives, a lot of commonality in the experiences. So I think that it's more like, and this is another team who also did studies in reasons for abortions, Kirkman, and they say it's less the case that it's a response to the unique circumstances, but more that it's felt to be unique and it becomes their own story, and the decision becomes a personal decision rather than a general decision, I suppose. So from the perspective of the participant, the context and history is largely forgotten. So she experiences the decision as her own personal story, and many of them felt then that it was the right decision. So that comes back to the habitus where these are common sense decisions and they feel like they're the right ones. And this right decision is featured in almost all the narratives, and sometimes it's expressed confidently. So Darlene, again, was confident it was the right thing. Sometimes it's expressed hesitantly, I think it was the right thing, because at the time I wasn't ready. That was another participant. And sometimes it's expressed retrospectively. So Leanne, we had a quote from her. She said, the more time went on, she kind of went, no, yeah, I made the right decision. So to conclude then, to answer the question at the beginning of how does one make a personal decision, such as an abortion, in a social and political context. I conceive of the decision making as a journey and a navigation towards a decision. And I've presented the key features of that navigation, and starting with the liberal feminist framework that's become like fluoride in the water. And these values have been internalised and they lie unexamined until the unplanned pregnancy, which forces an examination of these values, usually though retrospectively and ongoing. And it's this framework that also provides the range of possible choices. And then there's the construction of the other, or the invoking of the other, which becomes that active positioning of self and other. And then lastly, there's the forgetting of the framework, and the experience of accessing abortion is experienced as unique and personal. And yeah, like I said as well, that feels like it was the right decision. So yeah, that's all for me today. Thank you. References as well. So there you go. Shall I stop sharing? Yeah, that's good.
Thank you very much, Dorinda. That was a really interesting body of research, actually. So we would like to open the floor up for any questions and answers. So for those that are online, please feel free to raise your hand so that we can give you an opportunity to ask a question. And is there anybody here in the room that would like to raise any questions for Dorinda?
I'll go if I'm not passing the line to anyone online, but if anyone online wants to jump in, please do. Dorinda, I've got a few points for you. I just want to start by saying I'm just always in awe of how you present your work, and every time I hear it, I've got all the feels, and it's just, you just do your subject matter such justice, so thank you.
Thank you.
So number one was simply to say that every time I read or hear anything of yours, there's always something new. So even though I've encountered quite a bit of what you're planning to put in your results, I've never encountered the stories you told when you were describing your methodology. I presume you're going to put those stories about why people sit where they sit in the article you're writing. Will they also be in the methodology chapter of your thesis? given that there are a bit findingsy as well.
This article that I'm working on, I am intending to make a chapter.
Good, because I think that's so important, and I think it's, as a standalone piece of work, it's excellent and has all the health uses that you described. The next point, the other points I'll actually give you offline, but the only other one I wanted to raise in this present audience was this question of invoking versus constructing the other. So there were three terminologies you used: invoke, construct, or active positioning. And you sort of said, I think invoke, I think construct, no, actually more invoke. And I'm not a sociologist or anthropologist, so those in the room will have a better view than me, but I would have thought that actually being clear which one you wanted to use and why, there'll be work on that you want to link into, and maybe you could share with us now what that looks like.
I guess I have been using construct, but I think every time and looking at my presentation now as I was preparing again, it always like jiggled in the back of my mind, and it was like, something's not quite right about it. And I think what it is that somewhere they are grabbing images that are out there, maybe, and maybe it's through TV or something like that. It's not, they're not creating these images themselves, and I think that's why I struggled with it, that term. At the same time, I guess they are constructing that as another, which says more about that relationship of like, okay, the images are out there, but now they're grabbing them and saying, oh, but that's that person and that's not me. It's actually very interesting that when the other, whichever other that I used in my slides, if it got too close and they could identify with it, then it was actually embarrassment, like the ones about the silly little girl. So I guess, those images which are sort of out there to use, right? But then they grab them. And it's more, I suppose, constructing the relationship of themselves with the other. And maybe that's where I get the active positioning. And
I like all of it. I like exactly what you just said. I just think when it's time to put it on work, connect up to the literature of others who've said similar things. And if no one's done this exactly, then,
I haven't written that chapter yet.
Do we have any other questions from others on the online platform? Or
I hate to be, but I wanted to ask Dorinda, were there any narratives of regret or any expressions of regret? Because obviously you conclude by saying that there's a certain kind of framing of the narrative as the right decision, whether it be for themselves, to others, etc. But were there any narratives that you could share about regret or something less than right, but not exactly wrong, ambiguity, any of those things?
There was one there who she couldn't say it was the right decision, but that was only one. She had a long history of like IVF and miscarriages, and she could not quite come to that point of saying, yes, it was the right thing. There were others who said they're never going to do it again. So they still then looked back and went, look, it was the right thing to do at that time, but would never do it again. So you had that kind of response as well.
And how do you think that links up to either the constructions or positionings or invoking of others, and also how do you read their sort of attempts at agency? Do you see that as expressing a certain kind of agency, or do you see that as expressing a kind of, I don't know, feeling trapped? How do you read on that in particular?
I think that it goes back to initially, like when they're sort of living out there every day in this framework of freedom and choice, and also then the image or expectations, I suppose, of what a good mother looks like. And this is just their everyday sort of ideas, habitus, shall we say. It's the unplanned pregnancy that disrupts that, and they have to act quite quickly on it. But it's the ongoing reflection and the retrospective, because it's interesting that the literature also sort of presumes that it's done and dusted and put aside, but it's actually, I think it's never gone. It's this ongoing process. There is a study by Trabulski, and she talks about how the past comes into the present, and that, yeah, and that it's this unexpected moments as well where the past comes into the present. So I think that it's more that retrospective examining also of the values, right? And then these values of motherhood that are described, they are also invoked, again, invoked that, you know, they're there, available, and then they're invoked to justify their decision. And that's an ongoing process. Yeah.
We have a question from Frida online, so if you'd like to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, it's less of a question. Thanks, Dorinda. Really, I agree with everything Kate said about the way you present your work. And I was just thinking about Sam's question about regret, and thinking of your honours thesis, which looked at the two websites, Voices of Regret and Shout My Abortion. And both are examples of women demonstrating agency, right? That they're telling their narratives in the different fora, whether they're narratives of regret or narratives of pride or celebration or whatever. So it's not, yeah, it's not that one demonstrates agency and the other doesn't. They're both, those examples from the stories on the websites were both examples of agency. So sorry, it's just a comment, not really a question.
Yeah, that's right. I'd agree. And that's why I do like to distinguish between the different kinds of agency, as in because we tend to valorize agency that ruptures and produces new structures, but we shouldn't discount agency that reproduces, you know, that is an active choice as well, or can be an active choice as well. Yeah.
I have a question. So just out of curiosity, I was just wondering with your sample group of so what sort of age bracket were we looking at? And did age itself sort of affect, I guess, the strength of their opinions about whether it's their decision or whether it's our decision in terms of the husband and wife together, or like, was there any sort of intersections there?
Yeah. Age was a pretty full range, because I did have the cutoff from 18, so I you know, so it's not younger than 18, and then to you know, in their 40s, and then of course you have the narratives of that the family's complete and want to move on to other things, sort of a thing. You mean regarding the relationship?
Yes.
Yeah. There was another example as well where there was very much talking about the husband and the lack of support that she felt from that. She actually sort of said a similar thing of where, like, we're in this together, but in a sense she used it in a different way. Rather than loyalty to the husband, it was more, if we decide this together, then also the responsibilities need to come together. And so she talked about it in that sort of a way, which I thought was very interesting. So, but yeah, there was an interesting, you did definitely get a number of the younger women who talked about, you know, going to university and learning about feminism, and that changed their thoughts about what they thought about, you know, the tropes of my body, my choice, decision making and participation in society, shall we say? So definitely variety. The relationship with the partner is a very interesting one, and I'm not quite sure how I'm going to deal with it, because they're actually quite. They have quite a bit of a critique, which we use in a gender lens, would be very interesting. Yeah, I think a disappointment somewhere that the men aren't there, which then also caused them to choose to have an abortion as well. Yeah.
Sorry, I have another question.
Yeah.
For you. I'm going to go.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm really interested in that section where you talked about constructing the others and the intersections of social forces in potentially shaping decisions, but also the idea of agency. You know, we're living in an increasingly unstable society politically. You know, things like climate change, those sorts of elements, longevity, you know, is it right to actually raise children under these various circumstances? What sort of intersections are you seeing in terms of making decisions about, you know, having children down the track, given that, you know, the world's a pretty crazy place right now?
Yeah, yeah. I did come across that. Well, one in the quote, she talked about the world being overpopulated, and then another one as well, she talked about that. And but again, it was more used as in terms of the other, whereas, like, you know, I think that they should make decisions like I make decisions about overpopulation. And in some ways they were using, I guess, what they judged really their lack of responsibility to highlight their responsibility of the responsible decision that they made. Yeah, so it wasn't very prevalent, I suppose, these concerns about the world and where it is and that sort of a thing.
Do you think it will become an increasingly prevalent?
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah,
It could do. Yeah.
it's very interesting because, like, it just made me think about how, you know, during wartime, like when soldiers come back, all of a sudden you get like a baby boom because they need to repopulate.
Yeah, yeah.
And you know, there are those similar sorts of responses in terms of environmental change and political instability. You know.
Yeah. Sure, take this back. Do you want this back? Sure. Okay.
Well, thank you very much again, Dorinda, for a really riveting seminar today. It was great. So if anyone else has any questions for Dorinda, please feel free to contact her directly. So next week, we have a guest speaker from Deakin University, Camille Daly, and for next week's seminar, it will be completely online. So yeah, we look forward to seeing you all back next week. So thank you again. Have a lovely weekend and take care. Thank you again, Dorinda.